Welcome back. In this step, let's shift our attention to something called a scope of a bean. SCOPE, scope of a bean. In the previous steps, we talked about the fact that your container manages the beans. So the beans are created and the life cycle is managed by this thing called a container. Let's take the example of binary search IMPL. So I have the binary search IMPL which has a sort algorithm as a dependency. So the container is creating an instance of the bean sort algorithm and it's creating an instance of the bean binary search IMPL as well. And over here we are trying to get that bean from the container or the application context. We'll be talking a lot about application context, container, bean factory, and the life cycle of the beans a little later. But for now, let's consider a scenario where here we are trying to get a bean from the application context. How are we getting it? Application context dot get bean. Now, if I do that again, so if I say binary search one and get the bean again, will I get the same bean or will I get a different bean? Every time I request the application context for a bean, will I get a new bean or will I get a copy of the old bean itself? Let's check what's happening right now. Let's do a sysout and say binary search. And next to it, I would say binary search 1. Let's run this application. This is the output that we would see. Binary search IMPL at this particular thing. So you can see that the hash code is the same. So this here we are referring to the same object. So when we are trying to get different instances of binary search from the application context, what we are getting is the same bean. So when we are requesting the application context for the same bean twice, we are getting the same instance of it back. This kind of beans are called singleton beans. In Spring, by default, any bean is a singleton. So if you're requesting application context 10 times for a bean, you would get the same bean back. That's the default. That's singleton. The other scope which is present in Spring is something called prototype. In the case of a prototype, you would get a new bean whenever it is requested. Whenever you're requesting a prototype bean twice, you would get two different instances of that specific bean. The other scopes which are present in Spring are called request and session scope. These are really useful in case of a web application. In a web application, as you would learn a little later, there is a separate thing called a HTTP request. One flow of a request from the browser to the server, processed on the server, and the response comes back to the browser. This is called a request. When you have a scope of request, then one bean is created per HTTP request. In the case of session, one bean is created per a specific user session. Let's not really worry about these request and the session scopes right now. When we talk about web applications, we'll discuss them in detail. Let's focus on these two things, the singleton and the prototype. We saw that by default, any Spring bean is a singleton. Let's say I would want different instances of binary search IMPL every time. How do I do that? The way I can do that is I can go to the binary search IMPL and I can put an annotation called at scope. I'll import it in and I can put a scope of, by default, what is it? By default, it's a singleton and I would want to make it a prototype. Now, let's run this again. You would see now that there are two different instances of binary search IMPL that are coming in. You can see that the IDs here are really different. Here we are making use of two different instances of binary search IMPL. So when we are asking the application context 2 times for binary search IMPL, it is returning two different instances of the beans. That's because you're putting an prototype. Hard-coding prototype here is not really a good practice. What we can do is use configurable bean factory. Configurable bean factory, that's one of the classes which is present. And from here, I'll pick up the scope from there. So configurable bean factory dot scope, I would want this to be prototype. Now let's run this, and you would see in the output that there are two different instances of binary search IMPL being used. And you can also explicitly specify the scope singleton and run it. This is default as well. So even if you don't specify anything, it's singleton. And you can see that this same instance is being used. The ID is the same. In this quick video, we looked at singleton versus prototype. We saw that how many ever times you request for a singleton bean from the application context, you'd get the same bean back. And if you're querying for a class of type prototype, then you would get two different beans back. Until the next step, bye-bye.